Sometimes the war ended long before the soldiers were told it was over. The truck engine idled beneath the wide Texas sky, its low rumble vibrating through the dusty yard of Camp Hearn as the afternoon sun hung heavy and gold above the fence lines. Heat shimmered across the open fields beyond the wire, stretching mile after mile of quiet farmland that looked nothing like the ruined cities most of the prisoners remembered. A line of German women stood beside the transport truck, their gray uniforms faded by months of work beneath the southern sun, their small canvas bags resting at their feet. Most stared at the ground. Some watched the horizon as if trying to memorize the shape of this strange country before it disappeared behind them forever. Among them stood Anna Keller, 24 years old. A nurse once, before the war had carried her farther from home than she had ever imagined possible. Her hands were folded calmly in front of her, but her eyes moved slowly across the camp yard as if searching for something she could not quite name. The wooden guard tower, the water tank beside the tool shed, the long dirt road leading toward the cotton fields where the prisoners had worked 5 days a week beneath the endless Texas sky. These had become familiar to her in a way that frightened her. Because familiarity meant attachment. And attachment was dangerous in a place where nothing lasted. A few yards away, Sergeant Daniel Carter stood with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. His uniform sleeves rolled against the heat, the brim of his cap casting a narrow shadow across his face. He had been assigned to Camp Hearn nearly a year earlier, long enough for routine to settle into his bones. Roll call at dawn. Work details by 7. Water breaks every hour once the temperature climbed past 90 degrees. He had learned the rhythm of the place the same way farmers learned the rhythm of seasons. Predictable, quiet, almost peaceful if a man forgot for a moment why the fences were there. Carter watched the line of prisoners without expression, but his eyes paused when they reached Anna. She stood straighter than the others. Not proud, not defiant, simply steady, as if some quiet part of her refused to bend even after everything the war had taken. He had noticed that about her. Months earlier, the first time she had stepped forward to help another prisoner who had nearly collapsed in the summer heat. She had moved with calm hands and clear eyes, speaking softly in German while guiding the woman toward shade as though she were back in a hospital ward instead of a dusty prison camp. Since then, he had spoken to her only a handful of times. Simple things. Work instructions. Water breaks. Short exchanges that never lasted long. But even those few words had slowly replaced the picture of an enemy he had carried across the Atlantic. The truck driver climbed down from the cab and glanced toward Carter. Ready when you are, Sergeant. Carter nodded once. Paperwork said the prisoners would be transported east before boarding a ship home to Germany. The war in Europe had ended months ago, but the machinery of war moved slowly, even when the fighting stopped. Carter stepped forward toward the line, the gravel crunching under his boots. A light breeze drifted across the yard, carrying the faint scent of cut grass from fields beyond the fence. For a moment, everything was quiet except for the truck engine and the distant call of a meadowlark somewhere across the open land. Carter stopped a few feet in front of Anna. He cleared his throat, keeping his voice even. You'll be leaving today. Anna looked at him. Not confused. Not surprised. Just very still. And in that stillness, something fragile appeared in her eyes. Something that had not been there when she first arrived behind the wire months earlier. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her small bag. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely louder than the wind crossing the Texas fields. I don't want to leave. The words lingered in the air between them, fragile and unexpected, as though the Texas wind itself had carried them there by mistake. Anna Keller did not raise her voice when she said it. She did not step forward. She simply stood where she was, her small canvas bag resting against her leg, her eyes fixed on Sergeant Daniel Carter, as if the quiet space between them suddenly held more weight than the entire camp around them. Carter did not answer immediately. For a moment, he looked past her toward the open fields stretching beyond the fence, mile after mile of late summer grass bending, beneath the slow breath of the afternoon wind. Out there the land rolled soft and green under a sky so wide it seemed impossible that war had ever touched the world. Cattle grazed somewhere beyond the distant tree line. A red barn stood half a mile away, its paint bright against the pale gold of the fields. It was the kind of landscape that made men believe life could return to normal if they simply waited long enough. But Carter knew better. War did not end all at once. It loosened its grip slowly, leaving people stranded somewhere between what they had been and what they were supposed to become next. Around them, the other prisoners shifted quietly beside the truck. Some watched the ground. Some watched the guards. One woman wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her uniform, though no one had said anything that should have made her cry. The truth was simple. For months, these women had lived inside the rhythm of the camp. Wake at dawn, work in the fields, drink water from the metal tanks that baked under the sun by midday, walk back through the gates at evening when the sky turned orange over the cotton rows. It was not freedom, but it was predictable, and predictability had become a kind of safety after years of uncertainty. Anna lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back at Carter. Her voice was steady when she spoke again. Not pleading, not dramatic, just honest in a way that made the words difficult to ignore. She said that Germany had nothing waiting for her anymore. Her family home had been destroyed during the bombing raids 2 winters earlier. Her father had died before the war ended. Her mother had disappeared during the long evacuation from the city. There was no letter, no address, no place she could point to on a map and say that was where she belonged. The camp, strange as it sounded, had become the first place in years where the days made sense again. Carter listened without interrupting. The truck engine hummed beside them, its steady vibration filling the quiet spaces between her sentences. He had heard stories like hers before. Almost every prisoner carried some version of the same loss. War rearranged lives the way a storm rearranged a shoreline, leaving behind shapes that no longer resembled what had existed before. But hearing Anna say it felt different somehow, perhaps because she spoke about it without bitterness. She simply described the facts the way a nurse might describe a patient who had survived a difficult night but was not yet strong enough to stand. Carter glanced down at the clipboard in his hand, even though he already knew what it said. Names, numbers, departure times, orders written in careful military language that left no room for personal decisions. The prisoners would be transported east by truck, then by train to a port where ships waited to carry them back across the Atlantic Ocean. Every name on that list would eventually disappear from the camp records. Another routine completed. Another chapter quietly closed. He folded the clipboard against his side and looked back at Anna. For a second, he almost said something that had no place in an army report. Something simple, something human, but the words stayed where they were. Instead, he spoke the only truth he was allowed to offer. The war had ended. The prisoners were going home. That was how the story was supposed to finish. Anna nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer all along. Yet the look in her eyes did not fade. It remained there, quiet and stubborn, like a small candle burning in a room everyone else believed was already dark. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind moved instead, sliding slowly across the open Texas fields beyond the wire fence, carrying with it the smell of sun-warmed grass and dry earth. Somewhere far beyond the camp, a tractor engine rattled faintly, the steady mechanical rhythm of farm work that continued no matter what nations were doing across the ocean. Camp Hearn had always existed in that strange space between war and ordinary life. The fences were real. The guard towers were real. Yet beyond them stretched quiet farmland that looked exactly like the pictures in old American magazines the prisoners sometimes found lining supply crates. Red barns, white farmhouses, miles of open sky. Anna Keller had spent months watching that landscape from the edge of the cotton rows where the prisoners worked. At first, she had studied it the way a traveler studies a foreign country. Carefully, suspiciously, every movement cautious, every sound unfamiliar. But time had a way of softening even the sharpest edges of fear. The first week, she had barely spoken to anyone except the women who slept in the same barracks. The second week, she began to notice the rhythm of the place. Guards who checked water barrels every hour once the temperature climbed above 90 degrees. A farmer who sometimes tipped his hat politely when the work truck passed his land. A pair of meadowlarks that nested in the fence posts every spring morning. Small things, quiet things. The kind of details people only noticed when life slowed down enough to let them breathe again. She remembered the day she first spoke more than 2 words to Sergeant Daniel Carter. A younger prisoner had collapsed in the field during the hottest week of July, her face pale beneath the brutal Texas sun. Anna had knelt beside her automatically, the training of a nurse stronger than fear or exhaustion. She had asked for water, asked for shade, asked someone to lift the woman carefully because heat exhaustion could turn dangerous if handled wrong. Carter had stepped forward without hesitation. He had not asked permission from another guard. He had not raised his voice. He simply helped move the woman into the narrow shadow beside the supply truck and handed Anna a clean cloth from the medical crate. That had been the first moment something inside her shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough to make her realize that the picture of Americans she had grown up hearing might not match the men who stood in this camp yard every morning counting prisoners and unlocking gates. Carter seemed to remember that same day now. His eyes moved briefly toward the distant fields as if the memory lived somewhere out there among the long rows of cotton. When he spoke again, his voice carried the quiet patience of someone who had spent many months giving instructions to people who did not want to hear them. He told Anna that going home might not feel like home right away. Europe had changed. Every soldier who returned from overseas said the same thing. Cities rebuilt themselves slowly. Families scattered during the war sometimes found their way back together years later. Life rarely returned in the shape people expected. Anna listened without interrupting. The other women beside the truck had begun climbing into the open bed one by one under the direction of another guard. Boots scraped against metal steps. Canvas bags thumped softly against the wooden floorboards. Yet Anna remained where she stood, her eyes steady on Carter, as if she needed to remember his face clearly before the road carried her away from this place forever. The wind lifted a strand of pale hair across her cheek. She brushed it back absent-mindedly and looked once more toward the wide Texas horizon. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than before, but no less certain. She said that during the war, she had seen many places disappear. Hospitals turned into empty buildings. Streets turned into fields of broken stone. People who believed they would return home one day only to discover there was no home left waiting. She paused then, searching for the right words in a language that still felt unfamiliar on her tongue. Finally, she looked back at Carter and said that this camp had been the first place in years where the days felt ordinary again. Wake up, work, eat, sleep. No air raid sirens. No sudden evacuations. Just the quiet routine of people living one day after another. And sometimes, she added carefully, ordinary life was harder to leave than anyone expected. The truck bed was nearly full now. One by one, the remaining prisoners climbed up with the quiet obedience that months of routine had taught them. Boots scraped softly against the metal step. Canvas bags shifted across rough wooden boards. No one spoke very loudly. Even the guards seemed to move more carefully than usual, as if the simple act of leaving required a certain respect. Anna Keller still stood on the ground beside Sergeant Daniel Carter while the last of the women settled into the truck. The engine hummed steadily beside them, its sound low and patient like a machine that had performed this same duty many times before. Dust stirred across the yard each time the wind moved through the open gate. Beyond the fence, the Texas countryside stretched wide and calm beneath the late afternoon sun. The light had begun to soften now, turning the distant fields pale gold. A row of cotton plants along the far edge of the property leaned gently in the breeze. Anna looked at them the way someone might look at a place that had quietly become part of their life without asking permission. She remembered the first morning she had walked those rows under guard nearly 8 months earlier. The heat had already been climbing past 80 degrees before sunrise. The cotton leaves had brushed softly against her sleeves as she worked, the long fields stretching so far that the end of them disappeared into the shimmering air. At the time, she had thought only about surviving the day, surviving the week, surviving whatever came next. But something strange had happened over the months that followed. The days had begun to fit together like pieces of a simple puzzle. Work in the morning, lunch beneath the shade of a water tank that rattled softly whenever the wind touched it. A quiet walk back through the camp gates at dusk when the sky turned deep orange above the distant barns. There had been laughter sometimes, too. Quiet laughter. Careful laughter that never forgot the fences were still there. Yet laughter all the same. Carter shifted his weight slightly and glanced toward the truck driver, who waited patiently behind the wheel. The man lifted a hand as if to ask whether they should leave yet. Carter gave a small shake of his head. Not quite. Not yet. He looked back at Anna. For a moment, the two of them stood there listening to the sounds of the camp as they had heard them every day for nearly a year. The creak of the guard tower ladder as someone climbed down. The low call of a bird somewhere along the fence line. The distant clatter of a metal gate closing near the supply shed. Small sounds. Ordinary sounds. The kind that became invisible once a person heard them often enough. Carter finally spoke again, though his voice carried less authority than before. It sounded more like the voice of a man explaining something difficult to himself. He said that sometimes soldiers stayed in one place long enough that it began to feel almost normal, even when they knew they would not remain there forever. He had seen the same thing happen to men stationed overseas. They learned the smell of the local soil after rain. They memorized the shape of hills they could see from the barracks windows. They told themselves it meant nothing. Yet when the orders came to leave, the land stayed with them longer than they expected. Anna listened carefully. Her expression softened slightly, as if she understood the thought. Before he finished speaking it aloud, she nodded once. Then she lifted her eyes toward the wide horizon beyond the fence again. The wind moved gently through the grass, bending it in slow waves that traveled across the fields like ripples across water. She said that before the war she had never imagined the world could contain so many different skies. In Germany, the clouds had often hung low above the city rooftops, gray and heavy most of the year. But here the sky stretched so wide it almost felt like standing inside an ocean of air. She paused for a moment, then added quietly that it was difficult to believe a place that looked so peaceful could exist during the same war that had turned so many cities into silence. Carter followed her gaze toward the horizon. He had grown up under this same kind of sky. For him it had always been ordinary. But hearing Anna describe it made him see it differently for the first time. The truck driver leaned out the window and tapped the steering wheel once. A gentle signal. Time was running short. Carter nodded slowly and stepped back from the truck. The moment had arrived whether either of them liked it or not. Anna looked at the open truck bed where the other women waited. Then she turned once more toward the fields beyond the fence, letting her eyes rest there for a final quiet second before she reached down to lift her canvas bag and prepared to climb aboard. Anna Keller placed one foot on the metal step at the back of the truck, then paused. The warm steel vibrated faintly beneath her boot as the engine continued its steady hum. Around her the late afternoon light had shifted again, softer now, stretching long shadows across the packed dirt of the camp yard. For a moment she did not move. Her hand rested lightly against the wooden side panel of the truck while the wind brushed across the open field beyond the fence. It carried the faint smell of dry grass and distant soil, the same quiet scent that had greeted the prisoners every morning when they marched out to the cotton rows. She looked once more across that familiar landscape. The water tower beside the field gate stood exactly where it always had. The narrow dirt path leading toward the barns still curved gently through the grass about a quarter-mile away. Somewhere out there a lone tractor was moving slowly across the far pasture, its low engine sound rising and falling like a distant echo. 8 months earlier that land had been nothing but a strange horizon to her. Now it felt almost like a memory she had not expected to carry. Behind her the other prisoners made room on the truck bed. One woman shifted a canvas sack to the side. Another reached out a hand to steady Anna as she climbed up. The small gesture was quiet, almost automatic. In places like this people learn to help one another without speaking. Anna nodded her thanks and pulled herself onto the wooden floorboards. The truck bed smelled faintly of dust and sun-warmed wood. The women sat along the sides, their shoulders touching lightly as they settled in for the ride that would take them away from this place for good. Some watched the ground below. Others kept their eyes on the horizon beyond the fence, as if they were trying to hold the picture in their minds for as long as possible. Anna remained near the back edge of the truck. Her bag rested in her lap. Her hands folded loosely across the canvas as she looked down into the yard one last time. Sergeant Daniel Carter still stood where she had left him, a few feet from the open gate. His posture had not changed much, but something about the stillness of the moment made the distance between them feel larger than the few steps of dirt that separated the truck from the fence line. Carter raised his hand briefly toward the driver. The signal was simple. The time had come. The truck driver nodded and shifted the gear lever. The engine deepened with a low mechanical growl. Slowly the vehicle began to move forward, its tires crunching softly across the gravel path that led toward the open gate. The movement was gentle at first, almost hesitant. The women swayed slightly with the motion, adjusting their balance as the truck rolled ahead. Anna kept her eyes on the yard as it began to slide past. The wooden guard tower drifted slowly to the left. The tool shed followed. Then the long fence line came into view, its wire glinting faintly beneath the afternoon sun. The truck reached the gate and turned onto the dirt road beyond the camp boundary. Dust lifted behind the tires in a pale cloud that drifted slowly across the grass. Anna twisted slightly to look back. Camp Hearn was already shrinking behind them. The buildings seemed smaller now, the towers lower against the enormous sky. It was strange how quickly a place could begin to look like a memory the moment you started leaving it. Carter remained standing just inside the gate. He watched the truck roll down the road until the sound of its engine blended with the quiet of the countryside. For a long moment, he did not move. The wind tugged gently at the sleeve of his uniform as he looked across the same fields he had walked every day since arriving at the camp. In the distance, the truck was becoming little more than a moving shadow along the dusty road. Anna was still looking back when the truck crested a small rise about half a mile from the gate. For one final second, she could still see the shape of the camp buildings beneath the wide Texas sky. Then the road curved slightly between two rows of tall grass. The camp disappeared from view, leaving behind only the endless fields and the quiet horizon that stretched far beyond anything either of them could reach. The truck rolled steadily along the narrow dirt road, its tires pressing deep tracks into the pale dust that drifted slowly behind it. The camp had vanished beyond the low rise in the road, leaving only open countryside stretching beneath the wide Texas sky. The women in the truck bed sat quietly, the wooden boards beneath them vibrating gently with the rhythm of the engine. No one spoke for several minutes. It was not silence born from fear. It was the kind of silence that comes when people realize a chapter of their life has ended and the next one has not yet begun. Anna Keller kept her eyes on the road behind them long after the camp had disappeared from view. At first she could still imagine the tall guard towers standing somewhere beyond the hill. She could picture the long fence line and the dusty yard where the truck had been waiting only minutes earlier. But the farther the vehicle moved down the road, the harder it became to hold those images in place. The countryside slowly replaced them. Fields opened on both sides of the road, wide and green beneath the late afternoon sun. Some were planted with cotton, the pale bowls shining softly like scattered clouds across the rows. Others were empty pasture where tall grass moved gently in the wind. A farmhouse appeared in the distance about half a mile away, its white porch bright against the darker shade of the surrounding oak trees. Anna watched it pass slowly across the horizon as the truck continued forward. The land looked calm, peaceful in a way that felt almost unreal after years of uncertainty. One of the women sitting beside her finally shifted and spoke quietly in German, asking if anyone knew how long the journey would take. Another woman answered that they had been told a train station waited somewhere east of the camp, perhaps 30 or 40 miles away. From there, they would travel north toward a port where ships were already preparing to carry prisoners back across the Atlantic Ocean. The words hung in the air between them. Back across the Atlantic. The distance sounded enormous when spoken aloud. Anna lowered her gaze to the canvas bag resting in her lap. Everything she owned now fit inside that small sack. A spare shirt, a worn notebook, a few folded photographs she had managed to keep hidden through months of inspections. Objects small enough to carry, yet heavy with memory. The truck crossed a narrow wooden bridge where a shallow creek wound quietly beneath the road. The driver slowed slightly as the tires rattled across the planks. Anna looked over the side and saw clear water sliding slowly between smooth stones below. Sunlight touched the surface in brief flashes of silver. For a moment, the simple movement of that water seemed strangely comforting. Life continued moving forward no matter how uncertain the path became. One of the guards riding in the cab turned halfway around and called back toward the truck bed. His voice was calm, almost friendly. He told them they would stop soon at a supply station where the driver would check the engine and refill the water containers. The ride had only just begun. The road ahead stretched many miles before nightfall. Anna leaned back slightly against the wooden side panel and lifted her eyes toward the sky. The clouds above Texas moved slowly wide and bright against the blue horizon. She remembered telling Sergeant Carter that the sky here felt larger than the one she had known in Europe. Sitting in the moving truck, she realized the feeling had not changed. The sky still seemed enormous, endless, as if it belonged to no country at all. A gentle breeze flowed across the truck bed, carrying the smell of grass and warm soil. It brushed lightly across the women's faces as they rode eastward through the quiet countryside. Anna closed her eyes for a moment and listened to the steady rhythm of the engine beneath the floorboards. Somewhere behind them, Camp Hearn stood quietly under the same wide sky. Somewhere ahead waited a future she could not yet imagine. And between those two places the road stretched forward, mile after mile, carrying them farther away with every turn of the wheels. The truck continued east along the long dirt road as the sun drifted lower in the sky, turning the fields a deeper shade of gold. The air had cooled slightly since leaving the camp, and the breeze flowing through the open truck bed carried a soft rustling sound from the tall grass along the roadside. Anna Keller sat quietly among the other women, her canvas bag resting in her lap, while the rhythm of the moving truck settled into something almost hypnotic. The wooden boards beneath them creaked gently whenever the road dipped or rose. The engine hummed with steady patience, as though the vehicle itself understood that the journey would take time and there was no reason to hurry. The road curved slowly through open farmland where fences appeared only occasionally, marking distant property lines that stretched across acres of quiet pasture. Cattle grazed lazily near a small pond about a quarter-mile from the road, lifting their heads only briefly as the truck passed. One of the women beside Anna leaned forward to watch them, her expression softening for the first time since they had left the camp. Animals did not recognize uniforms or national flags. To them, the passing truck meant nothing at all. That simple truth seemed strangely comforting. Anna let her gaze follow the slow movement of the countryside. The sky above Texas remained vast and pale blue, scattered with wide drifting clouds that seemed almost motionless compared to the steady progress of the road beneath them. She wondered what the sky looked like above the cities of Germany now. She wondered if the same quiet clouds moved there as well, or if the air above her homeland still carried the heavy smoke of the years that had just passed. The thought lingered briefly before she let it fade again. Thinking too far ahead felt difficult when the present moment was already so uncertain. The truck rolled past a wooden sign, marking the entrance to a small rural supply station where the road widened slightly beside a long gravel lot. The driver slowed and guided the vehicle toward the edge of the clearing. A simple gas pump stood beside a weathered building with a tin roof that reflected the last bright rays of the afternoon sun. The truck came to a gentle stop, and the engine quieted to a low idle. One of the guards stepped down from the cab and stretched his arms briefly before turning toward the prisoners. His tone remained calm and practical as he explained that the stop would only take a few minutes. The driver needed to check the water tank and make sure the engine remained cool for the long miles still ahead. The women were welcome to stretch their legs beside the truck as long as they stayed within sight. The offer felt almost surprising after months of strict routines inside the camp. Slowly the prisoners climbed down from the truck bed, their boots touching the gravel with small crunching sounds. Anna stepped down carefully and stood beside the vehicle while the breeze moved gently through the clearing. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and dry earth warmed by the sun. A row of wooden crates rested against the side of the building, and beyond them a narrow dirt path led toward a small field where wildflowers had begun to grow along the edge of the fence line. Anna walked a few steps away from the truck, her arms folded lightly as she looked out across the quiet land. The road they had traveled stretched behind them like a thin ribbon of pale dust fading into the distance. Somewhere beyond those hills stood the camp that had quietly become part of her memory. Somewhere ahead waited train tracks and ships and oceans she had not seen since the war began. She closed her eyes for a brief moment and listened to the sounds around her. A screen door creaked softly as someone stepped out of the small building. The truck engine ticked gently as it cooled. Wind moved through the tall grass with a whispering sound that seemed almost like distant voices. When she opened her eyes again, the sky above the clearing had begun to shift toward evening, and the long road east waited patiently for them to continue. The stop beside the small supply station lasted longer than anyone expected, though no one complained. The driver lifted the metal hood of the truck and leaned over the engine, while another guard filled the water container from a hand pump near the building. The slow creak of the pump handle rose and fell in steady rhythm, echoing softly across the open clearing. Anna Keller stood near the edge of the gravel lot with the other women, her arms folded lightly as she watched the quiet scene unfold. The world beyond the war seemed strangely ordinary here. A wooden sign hung above the station door, its faded paint barely visible beneath years of sun and wind. A screen door opened once, and an older man stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth as he glanced toward the parked truck. His expression carried mild curiosity, but no alarm. For him, the presence of soldiers and prisoners on the rural road was simply another passing moment in a year when many unusual things had become common. He nodded politely toward the guards and returned inside, without saying much. Anna noticed the small details around the station the way she had learned to notice details inside the camp. A pair of empty soda bottles rested on the window ledge. A wooden chair leaned against the wall beneath a patch of shade. Near the edge of the clearing, a narrow fence surrounded a small vegetable garden where rows of tomatoes and beans climbed carefully along thin wooden stakes. Life continued growing in quiet corners, even while the rest of the world struggled to rebuild itself. One of the prisoners beside her stepped closer and spoke softly in German, wondering aloud whether the farmers who owned these fields had sons fighting somewhere overseas. The question lingered in the air. No one answered immediately. The war had scattered people across oceans and continents in ways that were impossible to track. Somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean, men who had grown up on farms like this might be standing on foreign soil, wondering what their own fields looked like now under the changing sky. Anna walked slowly toward the fence line and rested her hand on the rough wooden rail. Beyond it, the narrow field stretched about 50 yards before meeting a stand of oak trees where the evening shadows had begun to gather. The wind moved through the tall grass with a soft whispering sound. For a moment, she could almost imagine that she had arrived here as a traveler rather than a prisoner. The difference between those two lives sometimes felt very small when the land itself remained calm and unchanged. Behind her, the truck engine finally started again with a low mechanical rumble. The driver lowered the hood and wiped his hands on a cloth before climbing back into the cab. One of the guards called out gently to the prisoners that it was time to continue. The women began returning toward the truck in quiet steps across the gravel. Anna lingered for one final moment beside the fence before turning back toward the road. As she walked, she noticed the sun had dropped lower along the horizon, casting long golden beams across the clearing. The air had cooled enough that the breeze carried a hint of evening freshness. She climbed back into the truck bed with the others and settled once more along the wooden side panel. The driver shifted the gear, and the vehicle rolled slowly out of the gravel lot, turning again onto the narrow dirt road that stretched east through the countryside. The small station disappeared behind them within seconds, its weathered roof fading into the quiet landscape. Ahead, the road seemed even longer now, winding through fields that gradually deepened into the warm colors of approaching sunset. Anna watched the sky as it slowly changed from pale blue to soft amber above the distant hills. Somewhere far beyond those hills, train tracks waited. Beyond the tracks waited ships. And beyond the ships waited a homeland she had not seen in years. The truck continued forward through the evening light, carrying them farther along the road that led away from the only ordinary days many of them had known in a very long time. The truck moved deeper into the countryside as evening slowly unfolded across the Texas horizon. The sun had lowered to the edge of the distant hills, casting long ribbons of amber light across the fields that stretched endlessly on both sides of the narrow dirt road. The tires hummed steadily beneath the wooden floorboards while a thin trail of dust drifted behind them like a fading memory of the path already traveled. Anna Keller sat quietly along the side of the truck bed, her hands resting on the canvas bag in her lap as the wind carried the cool scent of grass and distant soil across her face. The world looked different now that the day was beginning to close. The bright colors of afternoon had softened into warmer shades of gold and copper. Shadows stretched longer across the pastures where cattle still moved slowly among the tall grass. A farmhouse appeared on a gentle hill about half a mile away, its windows glowing faintly in the falling light as someone inside prepared for the evening. A thin column of smoke rose from a chimney and disappeared quietly into the vast sky above. One of the women beside Anna watched the farmhouse until it faded from view behind a row of trees. She whispered something in German about how peaceful the land looked here compared to the cities they had left behind years earlier. No one answered, but several of the women continued looking toward the horizon as if the calm scenery might somehow remain with them long after the road ended. The truck rolled onward, passing through stretches of farmland where wooden fences lined the road in uneven rows. Every few miles a mailbox appeared beside a narrow gravel driveway, leading toward a distant house hidden among trees. The names painted on those small boxes meant nothing to the prisoners, yet they suggested a quiet rhythm of life that continued here far from the battlefields and ruined streets of Europe. Anna lifted her eyes toward the sky again. The clouds had turned a soft shade of pink and gold as the sun slipped lower, and for a moment the entire horizon seemed to glow with a gentle warmth that made the long journey feel almost unreal. She wondered how many evenings she had watched the sky change like this while working in the cotton fields outside Camp Hearn. At the time, she had not realized those ordinary sunsets would become something she remembered long after leaving. The truck slowed slightly as the road curved around a shallow bend near a cluster of tall oak trees. Beyond them, the landscape opened once more into wide pasture land that stretched several miles toward the distant hills. The driver kept the vehicle steady, guiding it carefully along the uneven road while the guards in the cab spoke quietly among themselves. Their voices were calm, carrying none of the tension that had filled so many journeys during the years of war. Now the road simply led forward toward the next station, the next train, the next step in a future no one could fully see yet. Anna leaned back gently against the wooden panel and closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the rhythm of the truck settle into her breathing. The steady movement reminded her of long train rides she had taken as a child when her family traveled across the German countryside during peaceful summers that felt impossibly distant now. Those memories came softly, like echoes from another lifetime, yet they remained part of her all the same. When she opened her eyes again, the sun had almost disappeared beyond the hills. The sky deepened into rich shades of violet and amber, while the first faint stars began to appear above the horizon. The truck continued east along the quiet road, carrying the women through the gentle darkness of evening toward the train tracks that waited somewhere ahead. Behind them, the Texas countryside slowly faded into shadow, leaving only the long road and the endless sky guiding their way forward. The truck continued its steady journey through the deepening evening as the last glow of sunset faded beyond the distant hills. Darkness did not fall suddenly across the Texas countryside. Instead, it arrived slowly, like a curtain gently drawn across the horizon. The sky shifted from warm amber to soft violet, and then to a deep blue where the first stars began to shine quietly above the land. The road ahead stretched pale and narrow beneath the headlights, now glowing from the front of the truck. Their beams swept across the grass and fences along the roadside, briefly illuminating patches of field before the darkness returned behind them. Anna Keller watched the light move across the land with quiet attention. The night air felt cooler against her face as the wind flowed steadily through the open truck bed. Around her, the other women had grown even more silent. Some leaned back against the wooden panels with their eyes closed, letting the long rhythm of the road carry them forward. Others continued watching the passing landscape, though now only shadows and scattered lights appeared across the countryside. Occasionally, the truck passed a farmhouse where a single window glowed warmly through the darkness. Those distant lights reminded Anna of evenings long before the war when families gathered inside quiet homes while the rest of the world rested beneath the stars. The truck crossed another small bridge where the sound of water could be heard faintly below. The headlights flashed briefly across the slow-moving creek before the road curved again into open pasture. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. Life continued in these quiet places, following the steady rhythm of farms and fields even after the war had changed so many other parts of the world. Anna lifted her eyes toward the sky. Without the bright light of day, the stars seemed clearer now, scattered across the enormous darkness like distant lanterns. She had not noticed them often during her months in the camp. Evenings there had usually ended with the women returning to their barracks while the guards closed the gates and counted the prisoners once more. Tonight the sky stretched wide above them without any fence interrupting the view. The road eventually rose toward a low hill where the truck slowed slightly as it climbed. When the vehicle reached the top, a new sight appeared in the distance. Far ahead across the dark fields, a line of small white lights shone steadily along the horizon. They were arranged in a straight line that seemed almost unnatural against the quiet countryside. One of the guards in the cab turned halfway around and spoke toward the women in the truck bed. His voice carried easily across the night air. He explained that the lights marked the rail yard where their next part of the journey would begin. The train station lay only a few miles ahead now. The announcement moved quietly among the prisoners. Some of the women leaned forward to see the distant glow more clearly. Others lowered their heads as if preparing themselves for the next step that waited at the end of the road. Anna watched the lights without speaking. They appeared small from this distance, but she knew they would grow larger with every mile. Soon the truck would stop again. Soon they would step onto another form of transport that would carry them farther from the quiet fields of Texas. The truck rolled down the far side of the hill and continued toward the distant rail yard. The lights slowly grew brighter as the road approached the outskirts of a small town where narrow streets and wooden buildings appeared along the roadside. A few lamps glowed above storefronts already closed for the night. The truck turned onto a wider gravel road that led directly toward the train tracks. Metal rails reflected the headlights as they crossed the entrance to the yard. The driver slowed the vehicle and guided it toward a long platform where several dark train cars waited beneath tall lamps. Steam drifted faintly above the locomotives, rising into the cool night air like pale clouds. The truck came to a gradual stop beside the platform. The engine settled into a quiet idle as the guards stepped down from the cab and turned toward the women. The next part of the journey had arrived. Beyond the rail yard, the night stretched endlessly across the land, and somewhere far beyond that darkness the ocean waited for them to cross. The rail yard felt larger than it had appeared from the distant hill. Tall metal lamps cast wide circles of pale yellow light across the gravel ground and the long platform beside the tracks. The truck engine idled quietly for a moment before the driver switched it off, and the sudden silence made the faint sounds of the station more noticeable. Somewhere farther down the line, a locomotive released a slow breath of steam that drifted upward into the cool night air. The smell of coal and metal hung gently above the tracks. Anna Keller remained seated in the truck bed as the guard stepped down and spoke briefly with the railway workers waiting beside the platform. Their voices were calm and unhurried, the tone of men performing a task that had already been repeated many times since the war ended. One of the guards finally turned toward the prisoners and lifted his hand in a simple signal. It was time to step down. The women began climbing out of the truck carefully, one by one, their boots touching the gravel with small crunching sounds that echoed faintly beneath the station lights. Anna moved with them, lifting her canvas bag and lowering herself to the ground beside the others. The platform stretched several hundred feet along the track, where a line of passenger rail cars waited quietly beneath the lamps. Their windows reflected the yellow light like rows of small mirrors. For a moment, Anna simply stood still, taking in the unfamiliar scene. The station did not feel tense or hurried. It felt almost peaceful, as if the trains that once carried soldiers toward battle now waited patiently to carry people back toward ordinary life. A railway worker walked past them pushing a small cart filled with luggage tags and paperwork. He nodded politely toward the guards before continuing along the platform toward the first rail car. The routine was clear even without explanation. Names would be checked. Passengers would be assigned seats. The journey would continue. Anna followed the others toward the platform steps where the guards guided them into a loose line. The gravel path beneath her feet felt uneven compared to the smooth wooden floors inside the train cars ahead. She noticed how quiet the town around the rail yard had become. A few distant lights glowed from houses beyond the tracks, but the streets themselves appeared empty beneath the dark sky. Most of the town had already settled into sleep. One of the guards called the first group forward, and the women began boarding the train slowly. A narrow metal step led up to the doorway where another railway employee waited with a clipboard. Anna watched as each prisoner handed over a small paper card before stepping inside the car. The process moved calmly, almost gently, as though everyone understood that the long journey ahead required patience rather than speed. When her turn arrived, Anna climbed the step and entered the rail car. The interior surprised her. Instead of the crowded freight wagons she had imagined, the car contained rows of simple cushioned seats arranged beside wide windows. Soft overhead lights illuminated the narrow aisle while a faint warmth filled the air. It looked like the kind of passenger train that once carried families between cities during peaceful summers. Anna paused briefly beside one of the windows before sitting down near the middle of the car. Through the glass, she could still see the platform where the remaining women waited beneath the lamps. The truck that had carried them from the camp now stood empty beside the rail yard gate. Beyond the station lights, the night stretched quietly across the fields. The train conductor walked slowly through the aisle, checking seat assignments, while speaking politely to the guards accompanying the prisoners. His calm voice blended with the gentle clatter of metal tools outside where railway workers prepared the locomotive for departure. Anna rested her bag beneath the seat and leaned slightly toward the window. The cool glass reflected her face faintly against the darkness beyond. Somewhere behind those fields, Camp Hearn still stood beneath the same sky. Somewhere farther ahead, the rails stretched towards cities and ports and oceans she had not seen in years. The train remained motionless for now, waiting beneath the lamps while the final passengers boarded. Soon the wheels would begin turning again, and once they did, the long road that had started outside the camp gate would carry them even farther away into the quiet distance of the night. The final passengers stepped aboard as the station lamps hummed quietly above the platform. Inside the rail car, the air felt warm compared to the cool night outside, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and metal that had traveled thousands of miles along American rail lines. Anna Keller remained seated beside the window, her hands resting calmly in her lap, while the last footsteps echoed through the aisle. Across from her, one of the other women adjusted her coat and leaned back against the cushioned seat, closing her eyes as though the long journey had already begun to settle into her bones. The conductor moved slowly down the aisle, checking the final list in his hand before nodding once toward the guard standing near the door. Outside the window, Anna could still see the platform beneath the tall lights. A railway worker rolled a small cart away from the train, while another walked along the track with a lantern swinging gently at his side. The quiet routine of the station continued without urgency. It felt less like the departure of prisoners and more like the simple closing of another day. A few minutes passed before the locomotive gave a deep mechanical breath that drifted through the open night air. The sound carried across the rail yard like a signal that everyone had been waiting for. The conductor stepped toward the door and closed it carefully behind him. The latch clicked softly, followed by the distant clang of metal couplings tightening along the length of the train. Anna felt the rail car shift slightly beneath her feet. The movement was subtle at first, almost too gentle to notice. Then the wheels began to turn. Slowly the platform outside the window started to move past. The yellow station lights slid across the glass like small suns drifting through the darkness. Anna watched as the platform edge slipped away and the gravel yard followed. The truck that had carried them from the camp remained parked near the gate, its shape growing smaller as the train rolled forward along the track. Beyond the station, the rail line curved toward open fields where only a few scattered lights marked the distant town. The train gathered a little more speed as it left the yard behind. The steady rhythm of metal wheels against the rails began to fill the quiet interior of the car. The sound was steady and familiar, the kind of sound that belonged to journeys stretching across long distances. Anna leaned slightly toward the window and looked back one final time at the fading glow of the station lights. Within a minute, they had already become small points along the horizon. The darkness beyond them felt wide and calm beneath the night sky. Stars continued to appear overhead as the train moved deeper into the countryside. The fields outside the window slipped past in long shadowed shapes, interrupted occasionally by a farmhouse lamp or the pale reflection of water in a distant creek. Inside the rail car, the women had grown quieter still. Some rested their heads against the windows. Others simply watched the passing night. No one needed to speak. The movement of the train carried its own quiet understanding. Anna rested her hand lightly against the cool glass of the window. The reflection of her face looked different in the dim light than it had months earlier when she first arrived in Texas. Time had changed many things. Yet as the train carried her eastward, she realized something unexpected had remained. The memory of those ordinary days behind the fences had followed her onto the train. The cotton fields, the wide sky, the simple rhythm of work and rest beneath a peaceful horizon. For a moment she closed her eyes and let the steady motion of the rail car settle around her. The road that had begun outside the camp gate had now become a line of steel stretching through the night. Somewhere far ahead, ships waited along the coast to carry them across the Atlantic Ocean. Somewhere beyond that ocean lay a homeland rebuilding itself from silence and smoke. But here inside the quiet rail car there was only the gentle rhythm of the train and the long dark landscape sliding past beneath the stars. And with every mile the distance between what had been and what would come next grew quietly wider.